He walked into a police station to report something suspicious. Minutes later, he was the one in handcuffs. No crime. No resistance. Just a black maintenance worker with the wrong badge and the wrong skin color. But what they didn't know, he had already triggered an FBI takedown. The midday rain had mostly passed, leaving only a few scattered drops as Miles Darnell Hayes stepped into the Southside Police Precinct in Brentwood, North Carolina. His navy blue maintenance uniform still bore smudges of dust from the pipe chamber beneath the Fairwood Federal Courthouse, where he'd worked maintenance for 18 years. There was nothing remarkable about him, an African-American man in his early 50s, neatly trimmed salt and pepper hair, steady steps, eyes firm with purpose. But it was that very ordinariness that made him suspicious in the eyes of others. You can't just walk into the restricted area. That was the first thing he heard as he stepped into the precinct's tiled lobby. A white officer with a buzz cut and indifferent eyes blocked his path. Miles held up his ID badge bearing a federal seal. "I work at Fairwood Courthouse. This morning, I saw two suspicious men near the rear parking lot. One of them stuffed something into the trunk of a Chevy Impala, out-of-state plates. Thought someone should know." The officer squinted. "You a janitor or something?" "I'm a maintenance technician. Been there nearly 20 years. Before Miles could explain further, another man approached, Detective Brett Kincaid. Broad-shouldered, square-jawed, chewing gum like it was the only thing keeping him alert. "What's in the bag?" he asked flatly. "Tools." Kincaid didn't wait. He snatched the bag from Miles' hand and began rifling through it right there in the lobby. "You can't just walk in here, say you saw something suspicious, and expect us to take your word for it." Miles tightened his fists slightly. "I'm only reporting what I saw. If you need confirmation, call my supervisor, Sam Prescott. He'll vouch for me." But no one called. Kincaid glanced at the badge, barely reading it, then tossed it on the counter. "You're wandering around and not cooperating. Let's go." "You've got to be kidding me," Miles said, stepping back, disbelief in his voice. "I came here to help. Obstructing an officer. Maybe trespassing too," Kincaid muttered, reaching for the cuffs. Miles raised his hands, not resisting, just trying to slow down a moment spiraling out of control. But nothing stopped his wrists from being twisted behind his back, locked in cold metal. As they marched him down the hallway, the eyes of a few inside the station glanced up, then quickly away. Indifferent. Unmoved. As if they'd seen a black man in handcuffs one too many times to care. On the front desk, Miles' federal ID lay abandoned, face up, an ironic reminder that in this place, the truth mattered far less than bias. And the silence of those who watched. That, sometimes, was the loudest statement of all. The holding cell at Southside Precinct was cold and stifling, despite spring air blooming just beyond its concrete walls. The coarse gray bricks seemed deliberately designed to discourage lingering, and the weak hum of the overhead fluorescent light did little to ease the feeling of being invisible. Miles Darnell Hayes sat on a metal bench, hands clasped together, elbows resting on his knees. A fresh scrape on the back of his left hand still bore flecks of rust from the air duct he'd repaired that morning. His federal work ID, the only proof he hadn't lied, was somewhere outside in the lobby, discarded like trash on a desk. With each passing minute, he focused on keeping his mind clear, refusing to let rage or panic crawl into his chest. A soft hissing sound broke the silence from across the room. On the opposite bench sat a wiry young man, posture restless, eyes sharp like a concealed blade. "You're probably the only guy who walks in here and still sits like he owns the room," the man said. Miles lifted his head. "I'm Miles. Darnell, if you prefer. Jamal. But folks call me Slim." He gave a small nod in lieu of a handshake. "Heard you got locked up for reporting something?" Slim smirked. "That's crazier than what landed me here." Miles nodded slightly. "I thought I was doing the right thing. But it seems in here, right and wrong aren't defined by truth, they're defined by who wears the badge." Slim chuckled under his breath. "Facts. One time they kept me 3 nights just for walking out of a store without the receipt. Thought I stole something. I don't even blink at this stuff anymore. Miles exhaled slowly, eyes settling on the wall across from him. It wasn't sadness in his stare, just a weathered kind of fatigue. I've lived long enough to know some battles can't be won by arguing. Only by holding on to your own compass. The steel door clanged open suddenly. Officer Josh Reddick poked his head in, clipboard in hand. "Hayes, you've got a call." Miles stood, his movements slow and unhurried, as if nothing was urgent anymore. He turned to Slim. "Hope next time we meet, it's over coffee. Not behind bars." Slim narrowed his eyes. "As long as you're paying." Miles stepped out into the hallway, blinking against the harsh fluorescent glare. But the only thing that registered clearly was a brutal truth: the dignity of a black man could still be left behind a steel door, simply because he wasn't wearing the uniform society was used to seeing. But Miles had never been one to quit. And he knew this was only the prologue. On the second floor of the Fairwood Federal Courthouse, the dim afternoon light bled through frost-laced window panes. Samuel Sam Prescott stood by his desk, eyes fixed on the clock. 4:37 p.m. Miles Hayes had left before lunch, saying he'd stop by Southside Precinct to report the suspicious Impala parked behind the lot. But now his phone went straight to voicemail. 3 calls. No answer. Not a single word. Sam wasn't the kind of man to jump to conclusions. As a longtime facility supervisor, he'd seen employees miss shifts over hangovers, traffic jams, even oversleeping. But Miles was different. He had never been late. Never disappeared without reason. Which made this silence ring like an alarm bell. Sam opened his laptop and logged into the internal security camera system. He navigated to 12:03 p.m., the time Miles had left the building. The footage showed him walking toward his silver van, uniform still dusty, old tool bag slung over his shoulder. In another corner of the screen, the black Chevy Impala was still parked silently near the chain-link fence. But something made Sam freeze. Right after Miles exited the frame, a man in a gray hoodie appeared, moving quickly toward the suspicious vehicle before disappearing into a blind spot beyond the camera's reach. Sam rewound the footage. There it was again, something long wrapped in foil or cloth in the man's hand. A pipe, maybe. Or worse, a weapon. Without hesitation, Sam picked up the desk phone and called Southside Precinct directly. "I'm calling about one of my employees, Miles Darnell Hayes. He went there earlier today to report a security matter. I need to know if he's still there." "Hold on, I'll check," came a bored male voice. 50 seconds later, a flat reply followed. "We have someone named Hayes being held for questioning." "For what?" Sam frowned. "Obstruction, loitering, trespassing," the voice replied in a monotonous tone. Sam's chest tightened. "He's a certified employee of the federal courthouse. Has a badge. Level 3 security clearance." "Have you confirmed that?" "I wouldn't know, sir. Call back later." Sam didn't hang up in anger. He didn't say another word. He simply swiveled around, opened a locked drawer, and pulled out a business card, Audrey Linwood, Judicial Oversight Liaison. His fingers trembled slightly as he dialed. "Audrey, it's Sam Prescott. We've got a situation, serious. One of my techs is being wrongfully held at Southside. I need federal verification, immediately." Audrey didn't ask questions. "I'll escalate to DOJ. Give me 15 minutes. But Sam didn't wait. He attached the camera footage to an email and sent it to her with a note. Subject and video appeared after Miles left. Suspicious behavior. May be connected. 13 minutes later, a message from Audrey lit up the screen. FBI en route to Southside. Have Miles's original personnel file ready. Do not speak to media or local PD. Sam stood, both hands gripping the edge of his desk. A breeze from the open window rustled a local newspaper, flipping it open to a headline that read, Court security, how tight is tight enough? He stared at the words. Today, the question wasn't hypothetical. It had become reality. And he would not let someone like Miles Hayes be swallowed in silence. At the front entrance of Southside Precinct, the glass doors shuddered slightly as two black SUVs rolled to a stop. No sirens, no flashing lights, just silence with a purpose. Behind the front desk, a clerk looked up, pen hovering above the incident log, hand twitching slightly as four agents in black suits entered, synchronized like clock hands sweeping across the face of an unwelcome hour. Agent Dana Whitmore was the first to flash her badge. No smile. No explanation. We need to speak to the commanding officer. Officer Reddick peeked out from the break room. One glance at the group in black suits and his smug expression drained in an instant. In the holding cell down the corridor, Miles Darnell Hayes sat upright the moment he heard hurried footsteps and unfamiliar voices echo through the hallway. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from the sense that a tide was finally shifting. Sergeant Leon Granger met the agents halfway down the hall, his expression guarded but professional. Before he could speak, Dana handed over a sealed folder. Federal warrant, she said flatly. We've been tracking this case for a while. Today, we have probable cause to intervene. Inside the holding cell, Miles had no idea what was happening until the lock clicked. And an agent opened the door. Mr. Hayes, the agent said calmly, we're here to correct the situation. Miles furrowed his brow. I'm being released? You were never lawfully detained, the agent replied. You're a witness, not a suspect. And today, your statement will unlock something we've been waiting to expose. Miles stepped out. For the first time all day, he felt his feet fully grounded. Down the hallway, younger officers looked at him with puzzled expressions, not as the maintenance guy, but as the center of a storm gathering over the precinct. On the other end of the station, Reddick tried to back toward the exit, only to be intercepted by another agent. You're Josh Reddick, correct? Yes, Reddick croaked. You're coming with us. Just then, Kincaid returned from the lot outside. He hadn't even removed his sunglasses before being asked for his badge. He scoffed, but the sound died instantly when Dana Whitmore locked eyes with him. My advice, she said coolly. Cooperate. At the front desk, Granger opened the sealed file. A lengthy list of misconduct cases stared back at him: abuse of authority, unlawful detentions, deleted records, missing evidence. And one name appeared more than any other: Brett Kincaid. As Whitmore and her team began questioning Reddick and Kincaid, Miles stood quietly nearby. His eyes drifted to a bulletin board near the hallway. And there, tucked in the corner of a faded black and white flyer, a familiar outline, a gray hoodie. Wait, Miles said, stopping in his tracks. That guy, I saw him behind the courthouse this morning. That's the one I came to report. Whitmore paused. You're sure? Positive. He was hanging around the black Impala. Then he disappeared. Another agent was summoned, carrying a laptop. Whitmore opened the footage Sam Prescott had submitted earlier. This time, they zoomed in closer. The man in the hoodie wasn't just lurking, he was sliding a metallic object under the vehicle. Then a curious detail emerged. The man wore a watch. Not just any watch, a pilot model only issued internally to members of the state police force. Whitmore exchanged a brief word with another agent before turning back to Miles. We've long suspected that a few Southside officers were letting outside actors use the courthouse lot for drop-offs. But we've never caught it in action. You think that guy's linked to Kincaid and Reddick? Miles asked. We don't just think so, Whitmore said, her voice darkening. Now we've got a reason to investigate. She looked him squarely in the eye. And you just became a key witness. As Miles was led into the main lobby, Sam Prescott was already waiting. His eyes carried the weight of the day, but also a rare kind of relief. I'm here, T, he said quietly. They're going to have to answer now. Outside, a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by whispers and notifications. Phones were raised. Cameras were already recording. But this time, the silence wasn't fear, it was focus. A collective breath held in preparation for the truth. That very afternoon, an emergency meeting was convened at the Brentwood Regional FBI office. In the center of the room, projected on a wide screen, were the faces of two officers from Southside Precinct, Brett Kincaid and Josh Reddick. One by one, bodycam footage, internal memos, audio logs, and formal complaints were brought up. No dramatics, no preamble, just the weight of evidence, frame by frame, word by word. The Miles Hayes case was the last drop, Agent Dana Whitmore said, her eyes fixed on the screen as clip number 4 rolled. We have cases going back 2 years. A black woman held for 3 hours because she couldn't name which grocery aisle she just visited. A college student pulled over and searched while driving back to his dorm. The agents in the room watched in grim silence. Under Whitmore's questioning, a much larger web of misconduct began to unfold, one where equity was merely a header on a memo, while justice in the field was filtered through suspicion. Kincaid manually triggered recording system errors 27 times, Whitmore said, her voice sharpening. 19 of those were during stops involving black individuals. She clicked to the next slide. Reddick has 3 prior complaints for threatening behavior. In one case, he told a black father, "Bet you're real good at mopping down here, huh?" In the background, one agent winced. Another scribbled notes furiously. It was no longer about a single bad stop, it was about a culture, a habit, a pattern hiding behind procedure. During the review of Southside PD's internal records, Whitmore paid special attention to a clip submitted by Samuel Prescott in his original report. The man in the gray hoodie, who appeared just after Miles left the courthouse lot, wasn't found in any Brentwood civilian database. Whitmore leaned in, her eyes narrowing. Pause at frame 178, she instructed. Zoom in, 20%. Analyze the motion contour around that object in his hand. A glint of metal peeked out from under the foil wrapping. Whitmore's eyes didn't leave the screen. At the same time, a report came in from the evidence audit team. One of the items in the clip, a foil-wrapped metal pipe, matched the description of a confiscated object listed as unrecovered from a previous investigation. Its last chain of custody entry? A written statement signed by none other than Officer Josh Reddick. Whitmore rose sharply from her seat. The man in the hoodie isn't anonymous. He's a connector. A few hours later, a warrant for expanded surveillance access was signed. The FBI pulled video from a parking garage a few blocks from Southside Precinct. At 7:52 a.m., just after leaving the courthouse lot, the man in the hoodie parked the black Impala. And then, clear as day, stepped out and shook hands with Officer Josh Reddick. A firm, deliberate shake. Moments later, the two entered a nearby cafe, one with no internal cameras. Within just 24 hours, a search warrant was executed at a private garage on the southern outskirts of Brentwood, where the man in the gray hoodie was identified as working part-time. In a wooden cabinet at the back of the garage, agents uncovered a stash of evidence matching items listed in at least 6 unresolved loss reports from Southside Police Department records, an internal police radio, 3 improperly sealed drug packets, and, most tellingly, an old police ID card with the name deliberately scraped off. What did the man confess? Not much. But enough. Enough to link Kincaid and Reddick to an illicit evidence trafficking network that relied on intermediaries to keep their hands clean. At the same time, inside Southside Precinct, Sergeant Leon Granger quietly reviewed records. The more he dug, the clearer the pattern became. In just the last 2 weeks, Reddick had conducted 5 undocumented vehicle searches, 3 of which targeted black female drivers. It wasn't about ignoring others, it was about selecting the vulnerable. Bias had a method. The public reaction was sharper than expected. The Brentwood Herald ran an exclusive headline. Southside officers under investigation for bias and abuse, systemic rot or lone wolves. At the hospital, Miles Hayes watched the coverage on a tablet, Sam Prescott seated beside him. They only know half the story, Miles said quietly. Sam nodded. Then we'll tell them the rest. The investigation at Southside Precinct rippled far beyond Brentwood. Public scrutiny wasn't just focused on the officers under fire, it began to circle a now familiar name, Miles Darnell Hayes. The quiet man, once known simply for his grease-stained gloves and a belt full of tools, had become a symbol in conversations about integrity and civic responsibility. Miles didn't use social media. He declined interviews. He didn't seek a spotlight. But that silence only made his image resonate louder. The Brentwood Herald dubbed him the citizen who stood upright in the shadow of power. A now viral photograph captured him exiting Southside Precinct beside FBI agents, saying nothing, eyes forward. It became an emblem of a new generation that refuses to stay silent. One weekday evening, Miles received a special invitation from Langston High School to join a civic dialogue with students and parents. He hesitated. But Sam Prescott gently encouraged him. "You don't have to be a speaker. Just be yourself." That evening, Miles stepped up to the small auditorium podium at Langston High. The crowd wasn't large, but every pair of eyes was on him. His voice was soft at first, slightly hoarse, but each word struck deep. "I'm no hero. I just saw something wrong and thought someone should say something." Then, during the Q&A, a young girl raised her hand. "Mr. Hayes," she asked, "if you knew you were going to be arrested like that, would you still have gone back to the station that day?" The room fell still. Miles looked at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Yes. And next time, I'll bring a crowd with me." Laughter and applause broke out, not just for the wit, but for the strength behind it. Because they all knew, this man hadn't been broken. From that night forward, Miles wasn't just a quiet maintenance worker anymore. He became a living reminder that an ordinary act can open extraordinary conversations. That sometimes, dignity and silence speaks louder than any shout ever could. Less than 2 weeks after the video of Miles Darnell Hayes' wrongful arrest went viral, Brentwood City Hall was packed to capacity. Not because anyone had been subpoenaed, people simply wanted to be there. On the podium stood Mayor Dalton, visibly thinner than the last time he appeared on television. In the public gallery sat elderly citizens quietly nodding, students holding signs, and parents trying to answer the question from their children, why was that man arrested just for reporting something? "We're not here to justify anything," the mayor began, his voice low but clear. "We're here to acknowledge the truth and fix it." The first oversight hearing lasted over 3 hours. Witnesses, including former and current employees of the Southside Police Department, stepped up one by one. Some admitted to hearing about Officer Brett Kincaid's history of excessive force. Others provided overlooked emails, internal memos that were never properly archived. The list of violations grew longer by the minute. When the name Josh Reddick was mentioned, an administrative clerk broke down in tears. He laughed when I asked about due process for civilian rights. By the end of the session, the City Council officially announced the formation of the Brentwood Civilian Oversight Council, comprising attorneys, community organizers, and representatives from neighborhoods most affected by biased policing. The council would have authority to audit internal records, recommend disciplinary actions, and directly oversee enforcement procedures. On the final day of hearings, as the proceedings reached their conclusion, Presiding Chair Linda Wexler, representative of the Civilian Oversight Commission, adjusted her glasses and tapped the microphone. At last, the Commission will now present findings from the U.S. Department of Justice regarding connected parties, including the individual identified wearing a gray hoodie in the original video. The room fell silent. That individual has been identified as Caleb J. Carter, 34, a former informal operative in several undercover efforts with the Southside Unit. He was removed from departmental access 18 months ago due to erratic conduct. A photo appeared on the courtroom screen, Caleb's blurred face caught under dim security lighting, enough to spark recognition in those who remembered the early viral footage. Carter was found in possession of multiple unreported items at a rented garage in South Brentwood. These included improperly logged evidence linked to arrests conducted by officers Kincaid and Reddick, such as falsified narcotics packets and internal police communications devices unlawfully removed from official systems. The tension in the room was palpable. Caleb Carter has been indicted on 7 federal charges, including tampering with federal evidence, illegal possession of government-issued equipment, and obstruction of an active criminal investigation. He has entered a guilty plea under a deal with the FBI and will serve 9 years in Greenfield Federal Penitentiary. Wexler looked up, her gaze steely and unflinching. And we affirm, Carter's actions cannot be separated from the responsibility of the 2 suspended officers. This was not an isolated lapse, it was a coordinated abuse of power, enabled by institutional neglect and systemic privilege. Each word struck the air like a blade. The people of Brentwood deserve the truth and justice. By the next morning, the Southside Police Department announced the immediate termination of officers Brett Kincaid and Josh Reddick. At the press conference, Chief Inspector Leon Granger, usually reserved and soft-spoken, stood before the cameras, looking directly into the lens. No uniform shields a person from the consequences of abusing power, he said. And no system should be immune from oversight by those it's meant to protect. From one wrongful arrest, an entire city had opened its eyes. And more importantly, this time, the people refused to look away. That evening, in a small church nestled on the east side of Brentwood, the old wooden pews were filled to the brim. What had been a routine neighborhood meeting transformed into a gathering where people came to be heard and to finally say the things they'd kept buried far too long. A middle-aged woman in a business blouse stepped up to the podium, a trembling piece of paper in her hand. "I'm Joshua's mother," she said. "My son was searched after school just because he wore a hoodie when it was raining. He never told me until he saw the video of Mr. Hayes." Behind her, an elderly man with a cane recalled being ticketed for crossing the street too slowly, despite having a prosthetic knee. A young college student shared how he was detained at a supermarket for 30 minutes just because he'd looked out of place. These stories weren't loud. They weren't filled with rage. They were quiet, steady pieces of a larger truth. Brentwood had long operated within a system where suspicion defaulted toward anyone who didn't fit the white, middle-class mold. Agent Dana Whitmore, the lead investigator on the federal probe, stood at the back of the church, silent. But she listened. She took notes. And with each story, she nodded as if every word spoken was a piece of evidence that needed to be preserved. Miles Darnell Hayes wasn't there that night. But in every story shared, and every quiet sigh, everyone knew, his silence, his steadiness, had opened the door to all of this. On Monday morning, in a second-floor classroom at Langston High School, rows of chairs sat neatly arranged in anticipation of a special guest. On the blackboard, written in simple chalk, "Guest speaker, Mr. Miles Hayes, Brentwood's courageous citizen." Miles entered wearing his familiar maintenance uniform, no suit, no title. But as he stepped to the front of the room, the energy shifted. The students, usually distracted, chatty, fell quiet. There was something about him that drew attention. Not because of appearance, but because of a calm that couldn't be faked. "Some people call me brave," Miles began, his voice low and steady like the soft hum of the classroom heater. "But honestly, I just didn't know how to stay quiet when I knew something was wrong." He told the story not with anger, but with certainty. Every detail, from the suspicious Impala to the cold bite of handcuffs in the holding cell, was recounted like a technical task that needed to be completed, slowly, precisely, and without embellishment. They can take your dignity for a moment. But if you hold on to what's right, that dignity finds its way back to you, stronger than before. A girl raised her hand. "Were you scared, sir?" Miles smiled. "Of course I was. But fear doesn't mean you're wrong. What's scarier is seeing injustice and pretending not to." At the end of the session, the teacher handed him a thank you envelope and a student's drawing, him standing outside the police precinct, not with his fist raised, but with his arms at his sides, as if to say, "I don't need to shout to be heard." As Miles stepped out of the classroom, the late autumn sunlight streamed through the glass, casting a soft wash of light across his uniform. No one clapped loudly. But what he left behind in that room was something no law or media campaign could ever create. A standard to live by, steady and quiet, like a hidden foundation quietly reshaping an entire city.